We got a call that my mom's house was on fire.
The pattern of the fire did not fit an accidental occurrence.
This wasn't just a house fire. This was now a murder investigation. What happened here?
I feel like everybody that goes through something like this wishes they could go back and change it. I wish I could have stopped her. I wish I could go back and say, like, hey, you're on your own. Go tell the police right away. Obviously, if I could take it back, I would. But it was already too late.
She claimed she had no idea this was going to happen.
I remember feeling like I was going to die that day, that I felt like I wasn't myself anymore. I was a completely different person.
He told me how and what he knew, and I just wanted to know why.
The suspected motive was that she was going to end the relationship between the two girls. They became desperate to be together and see each other. No one was going to get in their way.
I regret everything.
July 8th, 2017, Morrison, Illinois. 18-year-old Kayleen Schroeder and her boyfriend are playing basketball at his home when they're interrupted by a call from her mother's neighbor.
We got a call that my mom's house was on fire. And so we jumped in, we go back, and we run to her house.
I got a phone call from Kayleen. She was hysterical. And she said, my mom's house is on fire. I mean, I just couldn't get there fast enough. I started, calling people saying, Peggy's house is on fire, get to her house, get her out, get her out. I was just panicking.
At the time, there was only a few people outside the house. And then, the news people started coming and the fire trucks, and that's when the streets started filling.
I heard the fire on the scanner, and we sent a crew to go check it out.
Morrison being a small town, the word traveled pretty quickly. I hoped and prayed that she had gotten out.
The first responding agencies to the fire was the Morrison Fire Department and the city police department. It was not a huge structure fire where the residence was to the ground or anything like that, but there was just a lot of smoke coming from inside.
First responders learned from family that Peggy lives at the home with her 15-year-old daughter, Anna.
But nobody knew where Anna was at that time.
They were fearful that Anna may be inside the home.
Your main concern is, are residents inside the house? Is anyone trapped inside? They need to conduct a sweep inside the house to see if anyone's in there. They started going room by room into the house, checking the area. That's when they found a body in a bedroom. Some type of sheet was on top of the victim that was laying on the floor. Initially, what we thought was someone was deceased due to the fire smoke inhalation. We're not believing any criminal activities involved. They assumed it probably was the homeowner, but they weren't sure.
My sister, Patty, she texted me, she said they found a body. I said, is the car there? And she said, yes. And then I just lost it because I knew. I said, then it's Peggy, because if the car's there, Peggy's there.
Then I knew when they said that there was a body in the house.
They were able to identify Peggy by a driver's license photo found on the scene.
I just that's Peggy's body in there. What happened? I was in disbelief. And I was hysterical.
Born in 1964, Peggy Schroeder grew up in Mount Carroll, Illinois, and was the youngest of 8 children.
We were raised on a farm, so basically, working out in the fields and stuff. Peggy was more of the fluff the hair, wear the dresses, play with baby dolls. Always laughing, always smiling, just happy. When she was probably around 5 years old, Peggy wouldn't respond to me when I talked to her. So I went and told Mom, I'm like, why won't Peggy look at me? And they ended up taking her into the doctors. And next thing I know, Peggy came home with hearing aids in both ears. She was deaf. She didn't seem to let it bother her or stop her from anything.
She was very good at reading lips. You could talk to her across the room and she could understand you.
Right out of college, she went to work at a factory in Morrison, and she stayed in Morrison. She just loved Morrison.
It was in Morrison that Peggy fell for an all-American man named Daryl Schroeder.
They met for bowling because he bowled a lot, and she liked to bowl too. She talked about Daryl in a very positive, giddy manner. And then she told me they were going to get married, and they wanted, to start a family. They did everything for her to get pregnant, and then they decided eventually to start, get all the paperwork done to adopt, which is how they got to meet Anna and Kayleen. She instantly fell in love with them. Kayleen was 5.
Anna was 2 years old. She was fun. She was full of energy.
She was very caring, and she taught us to sign so we could also communicate with her. She gave us everything we could need or want.
Oh, she would do anything for those kids. She was very happy being a mom.
Over the next decade of parenting together, Peggy and Daryl's relationship began to suffer.
They grew apart. It just didn't work out, so they thought the best thing for all of them was just to get a divorce. The girls moved into a house with Peggy and saw their dad, I believe, every other weekend.
That was pretty traumatic for all of us, to be honest. Anna took the divorce the hardest. She was really upset about it.
Peggy's life with the girls seemed to turn a corner, however, when she reconnected with an old flame named Frank Munther.
She was happy when she started dating Frank again. He brought a little spark back to her after the divorce.
Frank has 2 boys. Peggy had her 2 girls. And I knew she was getting really giddy, really serious. She just always talked, positive about him, what a hard worker he is. He's such a good man.
I had moved out, so the last time I spoke to her, I had messaged her that I was in a car accident, and she told me to message my dad about the insurance. I went into Morrison that night to stop at State Farm, and I was going to stop at the house, and I didn't for some reason, and I kind of regret that.
Now, only 2 days after Kayleen last spoke to her mother, Peggy, her body has been found inside her fire-damaged home. Peggy's youngest daughter, Anna, is still missing from the scene.
I was in disbelief. I was asking, where's Anna? She was nowhere to be found. I was trying to get a hold of her, and she wasn't answering. So I started blowing up Anna's phone. I'm like, where are you? There's an emergency. Please call me.
That's when Anna showed up to the fire. She was just bawling, oh, what happened?
I remember going across Peggy's yard to give her a hug. I mean, what do? You just prayed, Everybody was in disbelief.
I remember they brought out Peggy on this stretcher, covered, and, my heart sank. Seeing my friend, it was like a nightmare, what happened?
She loved burning candles. So I thought maybe a candle knocked over or it broke or something.
Maybe the fire alarms were going off, and because of her not being able to hear that, maybe she slept through it.
But as the smoke clears and investigators track down the root cause of the fire, they uncover a disturbing reality.
The local fire department said it looked like maybe 3 different spots that this fire initially started.
The pattern of the fire did not fit an accidental occurrence. There were no wire shortages or anything that may lead to an accident.
Peggy's body was found in her bedroom, and her body was covered with a sheet.
and the sheet all around her was charred, and that's where they believed was the point of origin of that fire. This wasn't just a house fire. This was now a murder investigation. What happened here? How did we get to this point, and where did things go wrong?
Coming up, investigators learn Peggy had recently been concerned for her own safety.
Peggy told me she bought a gun. I'm like, why? Peggy did not like guns.
Investigators were unable to locate Peggy's handgun in the home, so that also raised concerns.
And a forbidden relationship is revealed.
The desperation that the two felt was palpable. They felt like there was no other way.
She said, kill her, kill her. She doesn't want us to be together.
Hours after recovering the body of 53-year-old Peggy Schroeder from her charred Morrison, Illinois home, Whiteside County investigators have discovered evidence of arson.
At that point, there was still not a cause of death. Peggy's body was transported to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. Friends and family were completely stunned because they had no idea who would ever want to harm Peggy.
She's very caring, a very good mother, good sister, good daughter, good friend, always willing to help anyone. She just was that type of person.
As investigators interview Peggy's family on the scene, they discovered that the single mom had recently taken a precaution.
Peggy told me she bought a gun, which really surprised me because Peggy did not like guns. And I'm like, well, why? She said there's a lot of riffraff going on in her neighborhood. Cars were being broken into, and so she just wasn't feeling safe. She felt with a gun, at least she'd be protected. If somebody broke into their home, she wouldn't hesitate to use her gun if she needed to.
I didn't find out about the gun until she got it. And she was like showing me like, oh, it's pink. And I was like, oh, cool. She's like, I got it for my protection. You know, I can protect you girls.
At the same time, investigators were unable to locate Peggy's handgun in the home, so that also raised concerns.
The concern was, where did it go? Was this a break-in? And was it taken? There was a lot of unanswered questions.
After a thorough examination of the scene, investigators find no signs of a break-in.
Was there anybody who was angry or might have had a grudge against Peggy?
You want to speak to those closest to the victim, and that includes former romantic partners.
When I first met Peggy, she was married to Daryl, and then they went through a divorce.
As far as everyone knew, the exes remained amicable, and they were fully committed in co-parenting their children.
She did date a guy, Frank, that she talked about all the time. She adored the man.
But that relationship ended, and then she ended up moving to a house in Morrison.
Investigators reach out to Peggy's most recent ex-boyfriend, Frank, for more information.
Law enforcement contacted me a couple of times. I told them I met Peggy, good Lord, I must have been 22. We got back together again by talking on Facebook. She'd been divorced, I was divorced. She was fun, liked to talk, easy to get along with, just beautiful. So, I mean, you know, I was just head over heels in love with her. In 2012 or 2013, she moved in with my boys and I with her girls. I thought this was fantastic, you know, second chance.
When asked about his breakup with Peggy, Frank claims their children struggled to cohabitate.
It's hard to blend two families together to begin with. It really is.
Anna was very much, you know, mommy's girl. She didn't get along with the boys, and we had to move out.
It's not like we were bitter toward each other. We still talked, and we were at least friends. I really thought that when my boys got older and got out, we'd get back together again. At the day of the fire, I was at a ball tournament with my son, Robert. I was going to stand by the house and talk to her for a while, but then my son needed something at home, so I thought, I'll talk to her tomorrow. And I just went home, and I should have gone.
Frank seemed genuinely devastated by Peggy's death.
And investigators did let him know, hey, if you hear anything, if you see anything, please stay in touch. Peggy Schroeder was very amicable with every one of her exes. They were not involved in this crime.
Following their conversation with Frank, investigators begin canvassing the neighborhood for witnesses.
They try to see if they can get any answers as to what was happening ahead of the fire, and no leads were popping up at that point. Investigators definitely want to speak to 18-year-old Kayleen and 15-year-old Anna, who were on scene at that point.
Before investigators have the chance to speak with Peggy's 2 daughters, they receive unexpected news.
While we're on scene there, we get a call from dispatch that there's a female that needs to talk to the police in regards to this fire. I immediately left with the detective and went to the sheriff's office to figure out what was going on.
When he arrives at the station, Sheriff Booker is greeted by a 15-year-old girl, Rachel Helm, and her mother.
Rachel had identified herself as a friend of Anna Schroeder.
Because her being a juvenile, her mother was present. We had a juvenile officer in there as well. Then we began the interview.
I remember sitting down being interviewed. I was very, 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 very nervous. Because I felt like I was actually, for the first time besides telling my mom, speaking it out loud. And every time you speak it out loud, the more you process it.
She explained to us that she had information on the death of Peggy. We were just kind of in total shock that someone was just going to come into the police station, walk in and tell us.
I remember feeling like I completely hated myself. Some days, even now, I still do.
Hours after 53-year-old Peggy Schroeder was found dead inside her Morrison, Illinois home, 15-year-old Rachel Helm is at the sheriff's office, claiming to have information about Peggy's death.
I needed to get it out. I needed to tell somebody what I had done.
So then she walked through details of what took place.
According to Rachel, she had grown close to Peggy's youngest daughter, 15-year-old Anna, over the past year.
I first met Anna during summer before high school. Somehow she ended up on people you may know on my Facebook. So I ended up sending a friend request. We decided to meet up one day, and just things from there, we started hanging out. She had told me she had a hard time growing up. She got adopted. I knew she had always struggled with depression and anxiety and all that.
She was dating a boy, and then, one day, Anna just started hanging out with girls.
She had told me she was bi. I don't really know when I started exactly feeling things for her. I just remember how I asked her out. The Christmas parade was our first date.
She explained that her and Anna were in a dating relationship.
I remember her telling me her mom was not okay with it.
She said Peggy was kind of against that relationship.
Me and her had broken up, but we got back together. We didn't tell her mom. Her mom caught us hugging in the middle of the road, and I remember this specifically. She took us to the house because she was very mad. She sat us down on separate ends of the couch and decided to tell me about how her daughter did not want to be with me. Her daughter would never want to sleep with me, just stuff like that. I think overall I was just in shock. I felt kind of concerned at the time with how Anna was being treated. After that, me and Anna really didn't get to spend much time together, and I'm pretty sure that's obviously because her mom didn't want her around me. At one point, me and Anna had talked about running away. We had everything packed, both of us, but Anna went to say bye to one of her friends, and that friend told Peggy.
Anna got in trouble and was not allowed to see Rachel anymore. At that point, they started communicating mostly by text, and the two became desperate to be together and see each other.
Not long after that, this is when the first conversation to kill Peggy came up. The main one I remember is just with the gun. I remember her telling me where she found it, where it was at, which was under Peggy's pillow.
Rachel tells police that on the evening of July 6th, 2 days before the house fire, Anna made a shocking confession.
I got a text message from Anna, and she just straight up said, "I killed my mom."
Rachel claims she had no idea this was going to happen until Anna texted her and said it was done.
I didn't want to believe that the girl that I loved at the time was capable of harming anybody, let alone her own mother.
Rachel then decides to go to the house and be with Anna and help her cover up this crime.
I remember pulling up. Anna was sitting on the porch when I got there. As soon as I walked into the house, the first thing I do remember is seeing Peggy laying on the ground with a towel over her face and blood. I remember immediately running to the bathroom and getting sick.
That's when Anna told Rachel what had happened.
Anna waited for her mom to get home. When her mom got home, she told her she had a surprise for her, gave her a washcloth, tossed it to her, had her put it over her eyes, and then shot her in the head. Peggy died right there on scene. This is the first time that any of us are realizing that the victim, Peggy, was shot.
I just remember really being scared and wondering what the hell we were gonna do next.
So they went and did some errands, ran around town, got a bite to eat. They went to the dollar store.
I know we bought a lighter, gloves, bleach. Then I remember us going back and trying to clean it up. And I remember it not working very well.
That's when Rachel and Anna decided they needed to do something with the body. So they hauled it into a bedroom. They covered Peggy's body with a sheet.
Rachel says they lived in Peggy's home for 2 days until they finally came up with a plan.
They decided the best thing for them to try and do was set the house on fire.
I don't remember whose idea was the fire. I think at the time it was mine.
At 3 separate spots, small fires took place.
I remember us lighting it, and I believe that we just left after. We didn't even go and check to see if it had really gone anywhere. We went to a park. I told Anna to throw her mom's phone in the garbage, and then I got a hold of my mom to come get us. I told her she wasn't going with me if she had the gun on her. At that time, I was worried for my parents' safety and my own, and anybody else that was around us. Anybody with a gun, things can happen.
They got rid of the handgun in a cemetery.
My mom picked me and her up and took us to my mom's house. And then from that is when Anna's dad's wife got a hold of us, and we decided to meet halfway and drop Anna off by Walmart. After that, and I went back home, my mind really started to spiral. I was hyperventilating, I was crying, I was hating myself, I was hating Anna. I wish I could go back and tell Anna, like, hey, you're on your own, go tell the police right away. At one point, I had walked into the living room, and my mom could tell that I was upset. And she had asked me what was wrong, and I straight up told my mom everything from the beginning to the end.
It was pretty shocking to have a young teenage girl confessing to being involved in a homicide like this. You know, kind of hard to believe.
It was a weight off my shoulder for making the confession, but I also think it also added more because I didn't know what was going to happen next.
Rachel essentially confessed to being an accessory after the fact, but this was her story. When you're the investigator, it's your job to keep digging to verify if in fact this is the correct version of the truth.
To get to the truth, you have to talk to all sides, and that's where Anna needed to come into play.
Less than a day after Peggy Schroeder has been found murdered, 15-year-old Rachel Helm has confessed to helping her girlfriend, Anna Schroeder, conceal the crime.
The suspected motive was that Peggy was going to end the relationship between the two girls. They became more and more desperate that no one was going to get in their way.
I think I kept hoping that, hey, I turned her in, so everything was going to be fine. I was just going to get to go home. But I remember them telling me, like, hey, you're being charged with this, you're in custody.
Based on her confession to police, Rachel was charged with arson and concealment of a homicide. It was time to get the story from Peggy's daughter, Anna.
Investigators are trying to locate Anna. The Illinois State Police were involved with that as well. They located it, I believe, at her father's residence. Once they found Anna, they told her they needed to have her come down to the police station and talk with her. Our detective was there, Illinois State Police. They read her Miranda. She was willing to talk with them.
They kind of talked to her a little bit, and Anna is obviously very nervous, very scared. She's 15 at the time.
She wanted her dad present with her in the interview, which they did do.
And so when he does come in, they start this process again, and Anna does confess to killing Peggy. But she does point the blame on Rachel, that they were in a relationship together and that Peggy didn't approve of them being together, and Rachel was egging her on.
There was conversation with our state's attorney's office and decided, what to do with her. So she was detained at that point.
Because Anna was a minor, she was sent to a juvenile detention center, as was Rachel.
My dad came back and told me what really happened. Pretty much he just sat down on my bed and looked me in the eye, started crying, and said, Anna did it. And that was all he needed to say. And once I calmed down, he told me how, or at least what he knew.
As the couple sits behind bars, investigators review the findings from Peggy's autopsy.
But during the autopsy, we were able to confirm that Peggy was killed by a bullet to her head. But due to some fire, they weren't able to see that immediately.
The bullet came from a .38 revolver, which matched Rachel's claims that Anna used her mother's .38.
Investigators returned to the crime scene to collect evidence tying Anna and Rachel to the scene.
When the carpet was cut up, you could see underneath on the padding part, there was blood that was underneath on the floor and on the back side of the carpet. There was just 3 separate fires. You could see where they were trying to be ignited. The sheet on top of Peggy that was lit. Rachel mentioned getting rid of the handgun in a cemetery. We did recover the handgun behind a tombstone.
They were able to determine that that .38 pink revolver that Peggy owned was the murder weapon.
Everything that Rachel was telling us, we were able to find was true through evidence.
In order to confirm Rachel's culpability in the murder, investigators speak with Anna's family to better understand the young couple's dynamic.
One day, Anna was like, I think I might like girls. My mom was like, okay, that's okay. Just, now we're going to treat your girlfriends like how we would treat if there was a boy here,
I thought Peggy accepted it, but she just didn't want Rachel to spend the night if they were in a relationship. And I said to Peggy, that's fair because you didn't let Kayleen have boyfriends spend the night.
As the relationship got more serious, Anna started acting out more, started being more disobedient, started running around town more and just not listening.
Peggy was seeing a lot of issues with Anna's, like, being a little bit more disrespectful towards Peggy and, like, changing in personality, which she felt reflected a lot on Rachel. I asked Peggy about this Rachel Helms, and Peggy's like, well, I don't really like her hanging around because she seems to get into mischief when she's with this Rachel. Rachel puts a lot of things in her head. I'm like, well, then don't let her see Rachel. And Peggy's, oh, I can't do that. I don't want to upset Anna.
Anna switched to homeschool. Then I feel like with all that free time, it was just Rachel, Rachel, Rachel.
And in my head, I kept thinking, what kind of control did Rachel Helms have on her?
Anna's family was dumbfounded. The family really did not think that Anna had much to do with this, and they really pointed the finger at Rachel.
I do think Rachel had a lot of influence on Anna. I hate to say that, but I do.
Anna would do that to Peggy. Anna loved Peggy.
Rachel's story was that Peggy didn't approve of Rachel and Anna's same-sex relationship, and Peggy's family doesn't agree with that sentiment.
Peggy didn't care. She's like, I want her to be able to express herself for who she is.
They had concerns that Rachel was a bad influence on Anna. At that point, investigators needed more evidence to figure out the full story as to what happened. They had to verify who was telling the truth.
The murder of Peggy Schroeder has sent shockwaves through her small Illinois community. To add to the tragedy, Peggy's 15-year-old daughter Anna has confessed to shooting her. Now, investigators need to determine if Anna's girlfriend Rachel is more involved than she's letting on.
There was extensive investigation done. Cell phones, any computers, iPads, search warrants were done on all of those to retrieve any information.
There were a number of text messages between Anna and Rachel in the weeks leading up to this tragedy.
Text messages back and forth on, wanting to be together, how they loved each other, wanting to be together no matter what. They would make things work between the two of them. And there was messages between them about taking Peggy's life.
The desperation that the two felt was palpable. They felt like there was no other way.
Rachel was the one basically pushing for her to kill her mother. And Anna was definitely acting out in whatever way Rachel was persisting her to do so.
All the text messages from Rachel to Anna, kill her, do it today, kill her. She doesn't want us to be together. It was nonstop.
Up to this point, Rachel was charged with accessory after the fact. But this evidence suggested that she possibly played a larger role in this crime.
She was, in my eyes, as a police officer and an investigator, she was just as much at fault with this because of text messages, communication, and being involved in burning the residence and trying to hide the homicide.
Based on the digital forensic investigation, it was found that Anna attempted to send Rachel a photo of her mom laying dead on the floor.
Not only was the picture sent, but a text was also sent at that time that essentially said, "I killed my mother." This is a daughter who has shot her deaf mother in the face. And Anna then sent that photo of her mother's body to Rachel. That's pretty disturbing.
After reviewing the evidence, Anna Schroeder was charged with first-degree murder, arson, and the concealment of the death of her mother.
As a mother, to think that a child that you've poured your life into and that you've adopted, given this child a chance at life, and to have that child turn on you in that way is unthinkable.
I know 100% without a doubt my sister Peggy would be here today if Anna did not know Rachel Helms. She's manipulative.
Peggy's family does agree that if Rachel hadn't egged on Anna, then none of this probably would have happened.
As a kid, I'm gonna kill somebody. It gets said a lot. You don't mean it. You're angry. I remember Anna bringing it up quite a bit, but when I was saying things, I was joking. I didn't think to take her seriously, and by the time I did, it was too late. It's not like I forced her or did anything to make her do this. It was her own decision. I wasn't even there when she did it. My lawyer had given me a letter that Anna wrote to her friend. The whole letter was about me and how I was a bad person and how it was my fault. I've never thought I'm a manipulative person. I think with or without me in her life, this would have happened.
Coming up, as the teens head to trial, justice for Peggy hangs in the balance.
The fact that the crime was terrible didn't change the fact that it was committed by children.
In the months after the death of 53-year-old Peggy Schroeder, prosecutors are preparing to take her daughter Anna to trial for her murder. For her role in the crime, 15-year-old Rachel Helm is charged with concealment of a homicide and arson. But prosecutors are still undecided if charges against Rachel should be upgraded to murder.
Ultimately, after weighing evidence and other factors in this case, prosecutors decided not to upgrade Rachel's charges to murder.
There's a few different things that you have to consider, like Rachel's age and her cooperation. The prosecution had a good choice to be able to lean on Rachel to prosecute Anna for the crime that occurred.
Prosecutors offer Rachel a deal in exchange for her testimony against Anna.
I wanted to own up to what I had done as a person, so I pled guilty.
Rachel was sentenced to about 11 years in prison for concealment of a homicide and arson, and that was also with time served.
The state still plans to take Anna to trial for first-degree murder.
We went through extensive litigation of the issue of whether or not this case should be handled in adult court or juvenile court. Ultimately, Anna was being prosecuted as an adult. We made them well aware that if the prosecution was going to insist upon prosecuting Anna for first-degree murder, they were going to face a trial, followed by an appeal on the issue of whether she should be prosecuted as an adult in the first place. The balancing of all of those issues ultimately gave rise to the plea agreement that occurred.
The state's attorney asked me to come in, and he goes, Anna's gonna plead guilty to second-degree murder and drop the first-degree murder. And I looked at him and I said, do I have a choice in this? He said no. He goes, I've accepted the plea bargain.
At Anna's sentencing hearing in November of 2021, she reads a prepared statement.
I'm the child who shot and killed her own mom. I'm sorry to my mom. I didn't think about what I was doing. I didn't think about forever.
Ultimately, Anna was sentenced to 20 years on the charge of second-degree murder. She is not required to serve that entire sentence, but in fact, can serve slightly less than half of that sentence.
Should have never been dropped to a second-degree murder. This was a pre-planned first-degree murder. Justice was not served in this case.
I do believe they deserve a harsher sentence. I don't think justice was served at all, and it never will be. I think they got away with it.
Obviously, I have remorse for everything. I regret everything. I wish I could go back and change it. I wish I could have stopped her.
After serving only 6 years, Rachel is released from prison.
In my eyes, Rachel got away with murder. I can't believe you could be involved in a homicide and be out in that little amount of time being incarcerated.
Anna wrote me from jail, just pretty much saying I'm sorry and, hope you can forgive me one day. I still love you. I just wanted to know why. And she said, I don't know.
I need to move forward with the happy memories of Peggy. Memories that pop up here and there that don't make me cry. They make me smile, just remembering her.
She was a good mom, a good friend, a good sister, a good daughter, an amazing worker. Peggy should be remembered as the amazing person she was.
I want my mom to remember it as the loving, caring mom that she was. She was a great friend to all, always helping. She was always just smiling, just always in a good mood, always willing to give whatever.
On the morning of July 15th, 1990, an ordinary workday began in Munich, Germany. The summer sun had already risen over the city, casting a warm light across the streets and apartment buildings of Bavaria's capital. For most residents, it was a quiet Sunday morning. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing suggested that one of the most shocking crimes in modern German criminal history had already taken place behind the closed doors of a private apartment. At some point that morning, the personal secretary of Walter Settelmeyer arrived at his residence on Elisabethstrasse. She expected a routine visit. Walter Settelmeyer was one of the most recognizable faces in Bavaria, a beloved television actor whose presence had become familiar to millions of viewers. For decades, audiences had welcomed him into their homes through television screens. He represented something comforting and familiar. He was a public figure whose image was deeply connected to tradition, reliability, and respectability. But what awaited inside the apartment was not routine. It was a scene of unimaginable violence. Inside the bedroom, Walter Settelmeyer was dead. The details that confronted investigators would leave a lasting impression even on experienced homicide detectives. The actor's body bore evidence of a brutal and sustained attack. He had been bound with tape. He had suffered multiple stab wounds. He had been struck repeatedly in the head with a hammer. Blood covered parts of the scene. The violence appeared excessive, far beyond what would have been necessary to simply kill. For the people who first entered that room, there was an immediate question. Who would do this? And perhaps even more disturbing, why? Murders involving public figures often attract attention because of the victim's fame. But this case quickly became something different. It was not merely the death of a celebrity. It was a mystery wrapped inside another mystery. The deeper investigators looked, the stranger the picture became. The apartment contained objects that seemed to point toward a particular explanation. Among the items found at the scene were condoms, a leather whip, and other sexual paraphernalia. At first glance, these discoveries appeared to tell a story. Detectives considered the possibility that the killing had emerged from a sexual encounter. Perhaps involved male prostitution, perhaps blackmail, perhaps a meeting that had escalated into violence. Those early theories seemed plausible. In homicide investigations, the first interpretation of a crime scene often influences the direction of the entire case. Investigators must decide where to focus their attention, which witnesses to interview first, and what motives deserve the most scrutiny. The objects found in Settlemayer's apartment appear to provide a roadmap. Yet, as experienced detectives would later discover, crime scenes can lie. Sometimes they lie by accident, because events are chaotic and evidence is confusing. Other times they lie because someone deliberately wants them to. And that possibility would eventually become one of the most important turning points in the entire investigation. But on that July morning, none of that was known. What was known was that a famous actor was dead. News of the murder spread rapidly. Across Bavaria and throughout Germany, people struggled to understand what had happened. Walter Settlemeyer was not known as a controversial figure. He was not associated with public scandals. He was not a celebrity who constantly appeared in gossip headlines. Instead, he occupied a unique place in the public imagination. For many viewers, he represented a certain vision of Bavarian life itself. The contrast between that image and the brutality of his death was difficult to comprehend. As journalists began gathering information, headlines focused on the shocking circumstances of the killing. Television stations reported the discovery. Newspapers published updates about the investigation. Public interest intensified with every passing day. Yet while the media searched for answers, detectives were facing a more immediate challenge. The crime scene was violent, but violence alone does not identify a killer. The victim was famous, but fame does not solve a murder. Investigators needed evidence. They needed a timeline. They needed a motive. Most importantly, they needed to determine who had been inside that apartment during the final hours of Walter Settlemeyer's life. The earliest clues pointed in several different directions at once. Some suggested a sexual motive. Others hinted at personal relationships. There were questions about money, about private associations, and about aspects of the victim's life that had remained hidden from public view. Every possibility had to be examined. Every assumption had to be tested. And as the investigation unfolded, one uncomfortable reality began to emerge. The Walter Settlemeyer, known to millions of television viewers, was only part of the story. Behind the carefully maintained public image existed a private world that few people truly understood. After the murder, that private world would become the subject of intense public scrutiny. Information that had remained largely unknown during his lifetime would suddenly become front page news. The result was a case that captured national attention not only because of the crime itself, but because of what the crime revealed. The murder investigation gradually transformed into something larger than a search for a killer. It became a collision between public image and private reality. It became a debate about evidence, motive, and truth. And eventually, it would become one of the most famous circumstantial murder cases in German legal history. But all of that was still in the future. At the beginning, there was only a body in a bedroom. A respected actor whose life had ended in extraordinary violence. A crime scene filled with unanswered questions. And investigators standing at the threshold of a mystery that would take years to unravel. The case seemed straightforward only for a moment. The apparent clues pointed toward one explanation. Then those clues began to lose their certainty. The more detectives examined the evidence, the less obvious the answers became. Assumptions collapsed. New theories emerged. Dead ends consumed months of investigative effort. Some of the most important breakthroughs would come not from dramatic confessions or eyewitness accounts, but from tiny details that were almost invisible. The path toward a conviction would be long. The controversy surrounding that conviction would last even longer. And decades later, people would still debate aspects of the case. Because the murder of Walter Settlemeyer was never simply about one night in July 1990. It was about how appearances can deceive. It was about how a crime scene can be manipulated. It was about the challenge of establishing certainty when direct proof is absent. And above all, It was about a man whose death forced an entire country to confront a reality hidden behind one of its most familiar faces. Before we can understand the investigation, the suspects, the trial, and the verdict, we must first understand the victim himself. Who was Walter Settlemeyer? Why did he matter so much to the people of Bavaria? And how did a man who seemed to embody stability and tradition become the center of one of Germany's most notorious murder cases? To answer those questions, we have to go back long before the morning of July 15, 1990, and examine the life of the man whose death would shock a nation. Long before his name became associated with a murder investigation, Walter Settlemeyer was known for something entirely different. To millions of people across Bavaria, he was a familiar presence, a trusted face who appeared regularly in their living rooms through television screens. His career had made him one of the region's most recognizable actors, and by 1990, his place in Bavarian popular culture seemed firmly established. For many viewers, Walter Settlemeyer was not merely an entertainer. He was part of the cultural landscape itself. Born in 1926, Settlemeyer belonged to a generation that had witnessed profound changes in Germany. Over the course of his life, he built a reputation that was rooted in consistency rather than controversy. Unlike celebrities whose fame depended on scandal, reinvention, or public spectacle, Settlemeyer became known through reliability. Audiences knew what they would get when he appeared on screen. He often portrayed characters that felt familiar to ordinary people. Policemen, farmers, traditional Bavarian figures, men connected to the values and customs that many viewers associated with regional identity. These roles helped create a powerful connection between the actor and his audience. Over time, the distinction between the man and the characters he portrayed began to blur in the public imagination. This phenomenon is not unusual. When actors spend years playing similar roles, audiences often begin to view them through the lens of those characters. The public image becomes inseparable from the performances. In Settlemeyer's case, that image was one of stability, conservatism, and trustworthiness. He appeared to embody a traditional version of Bavarian life. His reputation was built on familiarity. Viewers felt as though they knew him, even if they had never met him. This sense of familiarity would later become one of the reasons his death resonated so deeply. Throughout Germany, the murder of a stranger is tragic. The murder of someone who feels familiar can be profoundly unsettling. People often react differently when a victim occupies a visible place in public life. The crime feels closer, more personal, more difficult to ignore. In the days following Settlemeyer's death, many people struggled to reconcile the brutality of the crime with the image they had carried of him for years. How could someone so familiar become the victim of such violence? How could a man associated with comfort and tradition die under circumstances that seemed so shocking and mysterious? Yet public image rarely tells the complete story of a person's life. Behind every carefully maintained reputation exists a private reality. Sometimes the differences between public perception and private truth are minor. Sometimes they are substantial. In the case of Walter Settlemeyer, investigators would soon discover that the public knew only part of the story. Away from television studios and public appearances, Settlemeyer lived a life that was considerably more complex than the image many people associated with him. By 1990, he was not only an actor, he was also involved in business activities and owned properties in Munich. His interests extended beyond entertainment. Like many successful public figures, he had built a life that included financial and business considerations alongside his artistic career. He lived alone in an apartment in Munich, a city that served as both the cultural and economic center of Bavaria. On the surface, there was nothing particularly unusual about this arrangement. Successful actors often maintain private lives separate from their public identities. Yet following his death, Details emerged that dramatically changed public understanding of who Walter Settlemyre was. One of the most significant revelations involved his sexuality. According to information that became widely discussed after the murder, Settlemyre was gay. During his lifetime, this aspect of his personal life had remained largely unknown to the broader public. The revelation surprised many people, not because sexual orientation itself was connected to criminal behavior, but because it stood in contrast to the public image that had surrounded him for years. The contrast became a major topic of discussion throughout Germany. Newspapers covered the story extensively. Commentators debated its significance. Public curiosity intensified. The discovery created a complicated situation. On one hand, investigators needed to understand every aspect of the victim's life in order to identify possible motives and suspects. On the other hand, intense public attention risked shifting focus away from the murder itself. It is often difficult for high-profile investigations to maintain a clear distinction between relevant facts and sensational details. In Settlemyre's case, this challenge became apparent almost immediately. The revelation of his private life attracted enormous interest. Yet detectives still faced the fundamental task of solving a homicide. They needed to determine who killed him and why. The attention surrounding his personal life generated headlines, but headlines do not solve crimes. Evidence does. As investigators worked to reconstruct the final days of Settlemyre's life, they found themselves navigating a complicated landscape. They were dealing with a victim whose public image was widely known, but whose private relationships were far less understood. They were also dealing with a crime scene that appeared to suggest a connection to sexuality. Initially, these factors seemed to reinforce one another. If sexual items had been found at the scene and the victim's private life was becoming public knowledge, perhaps the explanation was obvious. Perhaps the murder emerged from that world. Perhaps the answer was hidden somewhere within the victim's personal relationships. But investigations are rarely that simple. The most obvious explanation is not always the correct one. Sometimes evidence points investigators toward the truth. Other times it points them in the wrong direction entirely. One of the most important lessons in criminal investigation is that assumptions can become dangerous. A theory that appears convincing at first glance may collapse under closer examination. Experienced detectives understand this. They know that every theory must survive scrutiny. Every assumption must be tested. Every possibility must be challenged. In the months ahead, investigators would do exactly that. They would examine Settlemyre's personal relationships. They would explore financial matters. They would analyze business connections. They would interview friends, colleagues, acquaintances, and individuals who had known him privately. Piece by piece, they would attempt to build a complete picture of the victim's world. Because understanding a homicide often requires understanding the victim. Not because victims are responsible for crimes committed against them. They are not, but because the victim's life frequently contains the clues that explain why a crime occurred. Detectives often ask a simple question: who stood to gain, who held a grievance, who had access, and who had a connection? The answers usually begin with the victim. In Walter Settlemyre's case, that process would eventually lead investigators away from some of their earliest assumptions. The story that initially appeared to revolve around sexuality and scandal would gradually evolve into something else. New questions would emerge. New suspects would attract attention. And a very different narrative would begin to take shape. Yet before that transformation occurred, the public remained focused on the image of the man they thought they knew. A respected actor, a beloved Bavarian personality, a familiar face suddenly gone. For many people, the tragedy began there, not with forensic evidence, not with legal arguments, not with suspects or trials. It began with the death of someone who had occupied a meaningful place in everyday life. The grief was real, the shock was genuine, and the questions surrounding the murder seemed to multiply with each passing day. Who had entered the apartment that night? What had happened behind those closed doors? Why had the violence been so extreme? And were investigators looking in the right direction at all? Those questions would soon lead detectives into one of the most challenging phases of the case. Because while the public struggled to understand the victim, investigators were trying to understand final hours of his life. To solve the mystery, they would need to reconstruct a night from which the most important witness would never speak again. And in that reconstruction, every detail would matter. By the time investigators began reconstructing the events that led to Walter Settlemayer's death, they faced a familiar challenge in homicide investigations. The most important moments had unfolded behind closed doors. There were no eyewitnesses who could describe exactly what happened. There was no recording of the crime. There was no surviving victim to explain the sequence of events. What remained were physical traces, forensic findings, and the difficult task of turning fragments of evidence into a coherent account of a violent night. The reconstruction that emerged over time was not based on direct observation, but on what investigators believed was most consistent with the evidence they found. According to the conclusions reached during the investigation, the critical events occurred during the night of July 14th and the early hours of July 15th, 1990. At some point during that period, Walter Settlemeyer received visitors at his apartment in Munich. Prosecutors would later argue that two men known to him, Wolfgang Worrell and Manfred Lauber, had entered the residence. One of the most significant aspects of the case was the apparent absence of forced entry. Investigators found no meaningful indication that someone had broken into the apartment. There was no evidence suggesting that the victim had been surprised by a stranger forcing his way inside. Instead, the available information pointed toward a very different possibility. Whoever entered the apartment appears to have been allowed inside voluntarily. That detail may seem minor, but in homicide investigations, it can dramatically narrow the field of possibilities. A forced entry often suggests a robbery, a random attack, or an unknown intruder. A voluntary entry suggests familiarity. It suggests trust. It suggests that the victim recognized the people standing at his door and had little reason to fear them. That conclusion would become increasingly important as investigators attempted to understand the motive behind the crime. At some point after those individuals entered the apartment, something changed. The exact nature of the interaction remains unknown. No surviving witness can describe the conversation. No transcript exists. The words exchanged in the apartment that night have been lost forever. What investigators could determine was the outcome. A confrontation occurred. Whether it began calmly and escalated or whether violence was planned from the beginning remains a matter that can only be approached through interpretation of the evidence. What is clear is that Walter Settlemeyer eventually became the victim of a sustained and brutal attack. The forensic evidence painted a disturbing picture. Settlemeyer was restrained. Tape was used to bind him. He was also gagged. These actions suggested a degree of control exerted by the attackers. Restraining a victim requires time. It requires proximity. It transforms an act of violence into something more deliberate. Investigators therefore viewed these details as important indicators that the attack involved more than a sudden burst of anger. At some stage, the victim lost the ability to freely defend himself. Once restrained, he suffered a series of severe injuries. According to the findings described in the case, Settlemeyer was stabbed multiple times. He also received repeated blows to the head from a hammer. The injuries affected numerous areas of the body, including the head, neck, chest, abdomen, and back. The sheer number and distribution of the wounds drew the attention of investigators from the beginning. Homicide detectives often examine the nature of injuries not only to establish cause of death, but also to understand the dynamics of an attack. Some killings are swift and focused. Others involve a level of violence that appears disproportionate to the act of killing itself. In this case, investigators concluded that the violence exceeded what would have been necessary to simply cause death. This observation led to an important question. What motivates such an attack? Excessive violence can sometimes indicate personal hostility, emotional intensity, or deep resentment. It can suggest that the victim was not merely an obstacle, but the target of strong feelings. Investigators, therefore, considered whether the attack reflected anger connected to a pre-existing relationship. However, they also remained cautious. Forensic evidence can reveal what happened physically, but it does not automatically reveal what occurred emotionally. Detectives could document the wounds. They could measure the injuries. They could determine the methods used. Yet understanding the mindset of the attackers remained far more difficult. The available evidence allowed them to describe the violence. It cannot fully explain it. Another important conclusion emerged from the medical examination. Some of the injuries appeared to have been inflicted while Settlemare was still alive. This finding suggested that the victim experienced at least part of the assault before death occurred. Such details are often among the most difficult aspects of homicide investigations. Behind every forensic report lies the reality of a human being enduring a terrifying experience. For investigators, maintaining professional objectivity is essential. Yet, even experienced detectives can be affected by cases involving extraordinary brutality. The murder of Walter Settlemare was widely regarded as one such case. As disturbing as the physical injuries were, investigators soon encountered another layer of complexity. The crime scene itself seemed to tell a story. The question was whether that story was true. When detectives surveyed the apartment, they found items that immediately attracted attention. Sexual paraphernalia was present. Condoms were found. A leather whip was among the objects documented. Some areas of the apartment appeared disturbed or disordered. Taken together, these details seemed to point investigators toward a particular interpretation. Perhaps the murder was connected to a sexual encounter. Perhaps it involved prostitution. Perhaps blackmail had escalated into violence. Such theories appeared plausible during the earliest phase of the investigation. In fact, many observers regarded them as the most obvious explanation. The combination of the victim's recently revealed private life and the items discovered at the scene seemed to fit together neatly. But homicide investigations often become most dangerous when evidence appears too neat. Experienced detectives learn to question even the most convincing narratives. Sometimes evidence genuinely points toward motive. Other times, evidence has been deliberately arranged to create a false impression. As investigators spent more time analyzing the scene, doubts began to emerge. Certain aspects of the apartment appeared unusual. Some detectives started asking whether the placement of various items truly reflected what had happened, or whether someone had intentionally manipulated the scene after the killing. Among those who examined the case was Munich homicide investigator Joseph Wilfling. Over time, investigators increasingly consider the possibility that the scene had been staged. If that interpretation was correct, the implications were enormous. A staged crime scene is more than an attempt to hide evidence. It is an attempt to control the investigation itself. By creating a misleading narrative, offenders can encourage police to focus on the wrong suspects, the wrong motives, and the wrong relationships. Every hour spent pursuing a false lead is an hour not spent pursuing the truth. Investigators, therefore, began considering a troubling possibility. What if the sexual elements of the scene had been intentionally emphasized? What if the purpose was to direct attention toward the victim's private life while concealing a different motive entirely? If so, the crime was becoming more sophisticated than it initially appeared. The killers would not merely have committed murder. They would have attempted to shape the story investigators told themselves about the murder. This realization gradually altered the direction of the case. Detectives could no longer assume that the most obvious explanation was the correct one. They needed to step back and re-examine everything. The victim's relationships, his finances, his business activities, his personal disputes. Every aspect of his life had to be reconsidered through a different lens. Yet despite these emerging doubts, investigators still lacked the one thing every homicide case desperately needs: a clear path toward identifying the perpetrators. The apartment contained evidence of violence, but not certainty. The scene contained clues, but not answers. Public attention continued to grow. Newspapers reported developments. Speculation flourished. The mystery deepened. Somewhere within the available evidence was the truth about what happened during those final hours. But finding that truth would prove far more difficult than anyone initially expected. What appeared at first to be a straightforward investigation was slowly becoming a labyrinth of competing theories, hidden relationships, and unanswered questions. And as detectives moved beyond the crime scene itself, they entered the longest and most frustrating phase of the case. For more than a year, they would search for the breakthrough that seemed always just out of reach. The murder of Walter Settlemare had captured the attention of an entire nation. Yet despite the publicity, despite the resources devoted to the investigation, and despite the shocking nature of the crime, the identity of the killers remained uncertain. The next chapter of the story would not be defined by dramatic revelations or immediate arrests. Instead, it would be defined by patience, frustration, and a painstaking search for evidence hidden within the smallest details. In many homicide investigations, there is a moment when the direction of the case becomes clear. A witness comes forward. A suspect makes a mistake. A piece of evidence directly connects an individual to the crime. Detectives often describe these moments as breakthroughs, the point where uncertainty begins to give way to certainty. The murder of Walter Settlemare was not that kind of case. Instead, it became a lesson in patience, persistence, and the frustrating reality that some of the most important criminal investigations advance not through dramatic revelations, but through the slow accumulation of seemingly insignificant details. In the weeks following the discovery of Settlemare's body, investigators in Munich faced enormous pressure. The victim was famous. The crime was exceptionally brutal. Public attention remained intense. Newspapers followed every development. Television reports examined every rumor. Yet despite the visibility of the case, detectives found themselves confronting a difficult truth. They had a murder scene. They had a victim. They had theories. But they did not yet have a convincing path to the perpetrators. The earliest stages of the investigation focused heavily on the apparent clues found inside the apartment. The sexual paraphernalia discovered at the scene seemed to suggest certain possibilities. Detectives explored whether the murder might be connected to prostitution, blackmail, or a sexual encounter that had turned violent. These theories were understandable. Investigators must follow evidence wherever it leads, particularly during the initial phase of a case. Every possibility deserves examination. Every lead deserves consideration. Yet as time passed, those early theories failed to produce the answers detectives needed. The investigation widened. More people were interviewed. More relationships were examined. More aspects of Settlemare's life came under scrutiny. Investigators spoke with friends, colleagues, acquaintances, and individuals who had known the actor personally. They attempted to map the network of relationships surrounding the victim. Who had regular contact with him? Who might have held a grievance? Who possessed knowledge of his routines? Who had access to him? These questions formed the foundation of the inquiry. The process was exhaustive. It was also slow. Hundreds of interviews generated enormous amounts of information. Some leads appeared promising before collapsing under examination. Others produced details that seemed irrelevant at first, but later acquired significance. This is often how major investigations unfold. Detectives gather fragments long before they understand how those fragments fit together. For more than a year, however, the pieces refused to form a complete picture. The case entered a period that investigators often dread: stagnation. The public saw headlines. Detectives saw uncertainty. The victim's fame ensured that every development attracted attention. But media coverage could not compensate for the absence of decisive evidence. The investigation remained active, yet meaningful progress seemed elusive. During this period, several possible motives continued to receive attention. Financial conflict was considered. Personal disputes were examined. Questions about business relationships emerged. Investigators also continued to evaluate whether aspects of Settlemayer's private life played a direct role in the crime. Each possibility contained elements that appeared plausible. None provided a complete explanation. As months passed, frustration inevitably grew. High-profile, unsolved murders create a unique kind of pressure. Detectives know that every passing day risks the loss of evidence, the fading of memories, and the disappearance of opportunities. Public expectations remain high, but investigations cannot be rushed into accuracy. A premature conclusion can be just as damaging as no conclusion at all. The challenge was therefore to remain patient without becoming passive. Investigators continued searching for something concrete, something capable of moving the case beyond speculation. Eventually, that search led them toward a category of evidence that would become central to the entire prosecution. The breakthrough did not come in the form of a confession. It did not come from an eyewitness. It did not emerge from a dramatic confrontation. Instead, it came from microscopic traces. Among the evidence recovered during the investigation were tiny, felt fibers. At first glance, such material might seem insignificant. To an ordinary observer, a fiber is little more than a fragment. Yet forensic science often depends upon precisely these kinds of details. Criminal investigations frequently succeed because offenders leave behind traces they never realize exist. Hair, fibers, fingerprints, biological material, and other microscopic evidence can reveal connections that are invisible to the naked eye. In the Settlemeyer case, forensic specialists analyzed the fibers recovered from the scene and from the victim. Their findings became increasingly important as investigators compared the material to potential sources. According to the evidence later presented, the fibers matched material associated with Wolfgang Worrell's vehicle. Today, such forensic analysis may seem routine. Modern audiences are accustomed to advanced forensic technology. But in the early 1990s, these techniques carried particular significance. Trace evidence analysis represented a sophisticated investigative tool, capable of identifying links that would otherwise remain hidden. For detectives struggling with a case built largely on indirect evidence, the fiber findings represented an important development. Yet even this breakthrough did not instantly solve the mystery. One of the defining characteristics of the Settlemeyer investigation was that no single piece of evidence conclusively identified the killers. Instead, investigators gradually assembled a chain of circumstances. The fibers mattered not because they proved everything, but because they fit alongside other emerging information. As detectives continued examining Settlemeyer's relationships and business dealings, attention increasingly focused on Wolfgang Worrell and his half-brother Manfred Lauber. Investigators learned that tensions had reportedly developed between Settlemeyer and Worrell prior to the murder. According to the investigation, disputes involving financial and business matters had strained the relationship. This discovery introduced a possible motive that differed sharply from the theories dominating the earliest phase of the case. If the murder stemmed from financial conflict rather than sexual circumstances, then the apparent clues found at the scene might take on a completely different meaning. Investigators revisited their growing suspicion that the crime scene had been staged. The theory became increasingly significant. If offenders wanted police to focus on one motive while concealing another, then creating a misleading narrative inside the apartment would be a logical strategy. The sexual elements of the scene, once viewed as potential explanations, now risked becoming potential distractions. Detectives therefore began reassessing earlier assumptions. The investigation was no longer simply asking what happened. It was asking whether someone had deliberately manipulated perceptions of what happened. Witness interviews also began contributing additional pieces to the puzzle. Investigators collected statements suggesting that the relationship between Settlemare and Worrell had deteriorated before the killing. These accounts did not establish guilt by themselves. Witness testimony regarding interpersonal conflict can be valuable, but it rarely provides definitive proof. Nonetheless, such statements added context. They helped detectives understand the broader circumstances surrounding the victim and the individuals who attracted suspicion. Another issue involved inconsistencies in the accounts provided regarding timelines and movements. Investigators carefully compare statements because contradictions can sometimes reveal deception or concealment. It is important to note that inconsistencies alone do not prove guilt. Human memory is imperfect. People misremember details for many reasons. Yet when inconsistencies appear alongside other suspicious evidence, investigators often view them as worthy of closer examination. Gradually, the investigation's focus narrowed. What had once been a broad search involving numerous theories and possibilities increasingly centered on two individuals, Wolfgang Worrell and Manfred Lauber. Detectives did not arrive at this conclusion overnight. The process was cumulative. Fiber evidence, witness statements, reported business disputes, questions surrounding timelines, concerns regarding the apparent staging of the crime scene. None of these elements independently resolved the case. Together, however, they began forming a narrative that investigators believed warranted serious attention. By 1992, approximately 2 years after the murder, the investigation reached a critical stage. Authorities arrested Wolfgang Worrell and Manfred Lauber. The arrests represented the most significant development since the discovery of Settlemare's body. Public reaction was immediate. Many observers interpreted the arrests as confirmation that the mystery had finally been solved. Others remained cautious. The nature of the evidence generated debate almost immediately. Unlike cases built around eyewitness testimony, recorded admissions, or indisputable physical proof, this investigation relied heavily on indirect connections. The distinction would become central to everything that followed. Detectives believed they had assembled a persuasive chain of evidence. Critics questioned whether the chain was strong enough. Those competing perspectives would soon collide in a courtroom. The arrests marked the end of one phase of the story and the beginning of another. For investigators, the challenge had been identifying suspects within a maze of competing theories and misleading appearances. For prosecutors, a different challenge now emerged. They would have to persuade a court that the evidence pointed convincingly toward guilt despite the absence of direct proof. The murder of Walter Settlemare was about to become one of the most closely watched criminal trials in Germany. And at the center of that trial stood a question that continues to appear in criminal courts around the world. How much certainty can be built from circumstantial evidence alone? The answer would determine not only the fate of the accused men, but also the legacy of one of Germany's most controversial homicide investigations. By the time the murder case of Walter Settlemare reached the courtroom, nearly 3 years had passed since the actor's body had been discovered inside his Munich apartment. During those years, investigators had transformed a baffling and highly publicized homicide into a criminal prosecution directed at 2 men, Wolfgang Worrell and Manfred Lauber. Yet despite the arrests, one reality remained unchanged. The central mystery of the case had never been illuminated by a witness who saw the crime take place. There was no eyewitness account describing the attack. There was no confession. There was no recording that captured the final hours of Walter Settlemere's life. As the trial approached, everyone involved understood that this absence would shape every aspect of the proceedings. The courtroom would become the arena where two competing interpretations of the same evidence would collide. For prosecutors, the challenge was straightforward in principle but difficult in practice. They needed to convince the court that the available evidence formed a coherent and convincing chain, leading directly to the defendants. For the defense, the objective was equally clear. They needed to demonstrate that the chain contained weaknesses, gaps, and uncertainties significant enough to prevent a conviction. At the heart of the case stood a question that has confronted legal systems for centuries. How should courts evaluate circumstantial evidence? Many people mistakenly believe that circumstantial evidence is inherently weak. In reality, courts throughout the world regularly accept convictions based on circumstantial evidence when multiple independent facts point toward the same conclusion. The issue is not whether evidence is direct or circumstantial. The issue is whether the totality of the evidence establishes guilt beyond the required legal standard. The Settlemere case would become one of Germany's most famous examples of this principle in action. The proceedings attracted enormous public attention. The victim's fame guaranteed widespread interest. But the unusual nature of the prosecution amplified that interest even further. Journalists followed developments closely. Legal observers analyzed the evidence. Members of the public debated the strengths and weaknesses of the case. For many people, the trial became about more than the murder itself. It became a test of how far a criminal court could go when direct proof was absent. From the beginning, prosecutors emphasized that the case should not be viewed through the lens of any single piece of evidence. They argued that focusing on one isolated detail would misunderstand the nature of the investigation. According to the prosecution, the strength of the case emerged from the way numerous pieces of evidence connected to one another. Each individual fact might appear limited when examined alone. Together, prosecutors argued, they formed a pattern that could not reasonably be ignored. Among the most important elements presented was the forensic fiber evidence. Investigators had identified microscopic felt fibers that matched material associated with Wolfgang Warless' vehicle. Prosecutors highlighted the significance of this finding because it represented a physical connection emerging from forensic analysis rather than witness recollection. Unlike human memory, physical traces do not forget. They do not change their stories. They simply exist, waiting to be interpreted. The prosecution argued that these fibers represented an important link between the suspects and the circumstances of the crime. Yet prosecutors did not rely solely on forensic evidence. They also introduced testimony regarding the deteriorating relationship between Walter Settlemere and Wolfgang Warl. Witnesses provided information suggesting that tensions had developed prior to the murder. According to the investigation, disputes involving financial and business matters had strained what had once been a close association. Prosecutors argued that these conflicts supplied a potential motive. Motive alone does not establish guilt, but motive can help explain why a crime occurred. In a case lacking direct eyewitness testimony, every element capable of providing context assumed greater importance. The prosecution also drew attention to inconsistencies identified during the investigation. Detectives had examined statements and timelines carefully, searching for discrepancies that might indicate concealment or deception. Again, prosecutors did not present these inconsistencies as independent proof of murder. Instead, they argued that the inconsistencies should be viewed alongside all the other evidence. This approach reflected the central strategy of the case. Rather than relying on a single decisive revelation, the prosecution sought to demonstrate that every significant piece of information pointed in the same direction. The image they presented was one of cumulative weight. Each fact reinforced the next. Each clue supported a broader narrative. Viewed individually, the pieces might appear incomplete. Viewed together, prosecutors argued, they formed a logical and compelling explanation of what had happened inside Settlemere's apartment. The defense approached the case from a fundamentally different perspective. Their argument began with a simple observation. No one had actually seen Wolfgang Worrell or Manfred Lauber kill Walter Settlemere. There was no witness who could testify to observing the attack. There was no confession. There was no direct proof placing a murder weapon in either defendant's hands during the commission of the crime. For defense attorneys, these facts were not minor details. They were the foundation of the entire case. The defense argued that prosecutors were asking the court to move from suspicion to certainty, without crossing the necessary evidentiary bridge. According to this view, the prosecution's theory depended upon interpretation rather than direct demonstration. Witnesses had described disputes, but disputes occur in many relationships without leading to homicide. Fiber evidence suggested a connection, but connections do not automatically establish murder. Inconsistencies in statements could have innocent explanations. The defense therefore maintained that the evidence, while perhaps suspicious, failed to eliminate reasonable doubt. This clash between competing interpretations transformed the trial into a broader discussion about criminal proof itself. What level of certainty is sufficient for conviction? How should judges evaluate a collection of indirect facts? When does a pattern become persuasive enough to support a verdict? These questions extended beyond the immediate case. Legal scholars and commentators paid attention because the answers carried implications for the criminal justice system as a whole. Throughout the proceedings, both defendants continued to deny responsibility. Their position remained consistent. They did not admit involvement in the murder. They did not accept the prosecution's reconstruction of events. The persistence of these denials contributed to the ongoing controversy surrounding the case. In many criminal trials, confessions simplify public understanding of events. The Settlemere case offered no such simplicity. The court therefore faced the difficult task of reaching conclusions based entirely on the evidence presented. As the trial progressed, judges evaluated the cumulative strength of the prosecution's case. The concept at the center of their analysis was one that German legal observers often associated with the term indicium possesse, a trial built upon circumstantial indicators. Such cases require courts to examine how separate facts interact. A single circumstance may prove little. A network of circumstances may prove far more. Ultimately, the court concluded that the evidence supported conviction. On May 21, 1993, the verdict was delivered. Wolfgang Worrell was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. Manfred Lauber was also found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. The court determined that responsibility for the murder had been established despite the absence of direct eyewitness testimony. The brutality of the killing played an important role in the court's assessment of the crime. The attack against Walter Settlemere had involved extraordinary violence. The victim had been restrained, stabbed multiple times, and repeatedly struck with a hammer. The court regarded the murder as especially severe, a conclusion reflected in the sentences imposed. For prosecutors, the verdict represented validation of years of investigative work. Detectives had spent more than a year struggling through dead ends and competing theories before gradually assembling the case. The convictions suggested that the court found their conclusions persuasive. For the defense and for the defendants themselves, the outcome represented something very different. Worrell and Lauber continued to maintain their innocence. Their denials did not end with the verdict. nor did broader public discussion about the strength of the evidence. In many criminal cases, a conviction brings a sense of closure. The legal questions are resolved. The public moves on. The Settlemare case followed a different path. While the court had reached its conclusion, debate continued. Some observers viewed the verdict as a triumph of careful investigative work and forensic analysis. Others remained troubled by the absence of direct proof. The controversy was not necessarily about whether the court had followed the law. Rather, it reflected a deeper tension that often accompanies circumstantial cases. Human beings tend to seek certainty. Yet the criminal justice system sometimes operates in situations where certainty must be constructed from fragments rather than witnessed directly. As appeals and legal challenges followed, the convictions remained intact. The courts upheld the judgments. Legally speaking, the matter had been decided. Wolfgang Worrell and Manfred Lauber were convicted murderers under German law. But history would show that the story was not over. The murder of Walter Settlemare would continue generating discussion long after the trial ended. Questions about evidence, privacy, memory, and public accountability would keep the case alive in ways few people could have anticipated in 1993. The verdict had closed one chapter. It had not closed a story. In the years that followed, the consequences of the case would extend far beyond the prison sentences themselves, eventually reaching debates about how society remembers crime and whether the past can ever truly be erased. When a murder trial ends and a verdict is delivered, there is often an expectation of finality. The investigation is complete. The court has spoken. The defendants begin serving their sentences. In the public imagination, the story reaches its conclusion. Yet some cases refuse to end so neatly. The murder of Walter Settlemare became one of those cases. Although the legal proceedings concluded in 1993 with convictions and life sentences for Wolfgang Worrell and Manfred Lauber, the broader questions surrounding the case continued to echo through German society for years afterward. In many ways, the aftermath became a story of its own, one involving memory, identity, public accountability, and the enduring consequences of a crime that had shocked an entire nation. Following their convictions, Worrell and Lauber entered the German prison system to serve life sentences. The court had determined that they were responsible for the murder of Walter Settlemare, and legally the matter had been settled. Yet the defendants maintained their innocence. Their position did not change after sentencing. They continued to deny responsibility for the crime, a fact that contributed to the ongoing public debate surrounding the case. Such debates are not uncommon in high-profile criminal investigations, particularly those built largely upon circumstantial evidence. Even when courts reach a definitive conclusion, public discussion can continue for decades. Some observers become convinced that justice has been served. Others remain troubled by unresolved questions. The Settlemare case generated exactly this kind of division. For many people, the verdict represented the successful resolution of a difficult and complex homicide investigation. Detectives had spent years assembling evidence. Prosecutors had presented a detailed case. The courts had carefully examined the available facts and reached a conclusion. From this perspective, the criminal justice system had functioned as intended. Yet others continued to focus on the nature of the evidence itself. Because there had been no eyewitness, no confession, and no direct observation of the murder, some legal commentators and journalists questioned the degree of certainty that could be achieved. These discussions did not overturn the verdict. Appeals and challenges failed to change the outcome. Nevertheless, the case remained a topic of conversation among those interested in criminal law and forensic investigation. In this sense, the murder of Walter Settlemare evolved beyond a single criminal act. It became an example frequently cited when discussing the strengths and limitations of circumstantial evidence. Years passed. Germany changed. The media landscape transformed. New technologies emerged. The internet gradually became one of the primary ways people accessed information about the past. During the early 1990s, most news reports existed in newspapers, magazines, television broadcasts, and physical archives. By the early 21st century, increasing amounts of information became permanently accessible online. This shift would eventually pull the Settlemare case back into public attention in an unexpected way. Before examining that development, however, it is worth considering the lasting impact of the crime itself. The victim at the center of the story was not merely a name in a legal file. Walter Settlemare had been a living person whose death affected friends, colleagues, and countless admirers throughout Bavaria. Public attention often focuses on suspects, trials, and courtroom drama. Yet every homicide begins with a loss. The legal process exists because a life has been taken. In Settlemare's case, that loss carried particular resonance because of his public role. For decades, audiences had watched him portray familiar characters on television. His presence had become woven into the cultural fabric of Bavaria. The shock that followed his murder reflected more than curiosity about a crime. It reflected genuine sadness over the destruction of a life that many people felt they knew. One of the most striking aspects of the case was the way it forced the public to confront the distinction between public image and private reality. During his lifetime, Settlemare had cultivated the image of a traditional Bavarian figure. Following his death, revelations regarding his private life generated extensive discussion. The contrast fascinated journalists and audiences alike. Yet perhaps the deeper lesson is that public figures, like all human beings, contain complexities that cannot be reduced to simple labels. The murder exposed aspects of Settlemare's life that had remained largely hidden. In doing so, it reminded observers how incomplete public perception can be. The man known to television audiences represented only one part of a much larger story. As the years continued to pass, another chapter emerged. After serving approximately 15 to 17 years in prison, both convicted men were released on parole. Wolfgang Worrell was released in 2007. Manfred Lauber followed in 2008. Their release did not erase the convictions, nor did it eliminate public interest in the case. Instead, it introduced a new and unexpected legal question. What happens after a convicted criminal has served a sentence and attempts to rebuild a life? More specifically, what happens when the details of a notorious crime remain permanently available online? Wolfgang Worrell became involved in legal efforts aimed at reducing public access to information about the case. He sought the removal of his name from certain online archives and references connected to the murder. The argument centered on privacy. After serving a sentence, should a person remain indefinitely associated with a crime in digital records accessible to anyone with an internet connection? This question touched on an issue that would become increasingly important in the digital age, the so-called right to be forgotten. Historically, the passage of time naturally obscured many events. Newspaper archives existed, but locating information often required significant effort. The internet changed that reality. Information became searchable, permanent, and widely accessible. Past actions that might once have faded from public consciousness could now remain available indefinitely. Worrell's legal efforts, therefore, extended beyond his own circumstances. They became part of a broader debate about privacy, rehabilitation, and public memory. The issue eventually reached the European Court of Human Rights. At stake was a difficult balance between competing principles. On one side stood the individual's interest in privacy and reintegration into society. On the other stood the public's interest in accessing historical information and maintaining accurate records of significant events. The court ultimately rejected the effort to remove the information entirely. The ruling concluded that the public interest in a serious criminal case outweighed the demand for complete erasure of historical records. The decision attracted substantial attention because it addressed questions extending far beyond the Settlemere murder itself. It became part of a larger conversation about how modern societies preserve information and how they balance privacy against transparency. In a remarkable way, the case that began with a homicide investigation evolved into a legal discussion about memory. The murder of Walter Settlemere had already influenced conversations about circumstantial evidence. Now, it was influencing conversations about digital history. This unusual trajectory helps explain why the case remains notable decades later. Most criminal cases are remembered primarily for the crime. The Settlemere case is remembered for multiple reasons. It involved a famous victim. It featured a highly publicized investigation. It became one of Germany's best-known circumstantial murder trials. And later, it contributed to debates about online privacy and the permanence of information. Yet beyond the legal discussions and historical significance lies a simpler and more human reality. At its core, this story began in an apartment in Munich during the summer of 1990. A man who had spent decades building a respected career was killed in an act of extraordinary violence. Investigators spent years searching for answers. Courts examined evidence and delivered judgments. Society debated the implications. But none of those developments changed the central tragedy. Walter Settlemere never returned home. His career ended. His future disappeared. His death left questions, grief, and consequences that extended far beyond the walls of the apartment where the crime occurred. Looking back today, the case offers several enduring lessons. It reminds us that public personas rarely reveal the entirety of a person's life. It demonstrates how easily initial assumptions can mislead investigators. It illustrates the importance of forensic evidence, particularly in cases lacking direct witnesses. It highlights the challenges courts face when evaluating circumstantial proof. And it raises profound questions about how societies remember both crimes and the people connected to them. Perhaps most importantly, it underscores the fact that justice is rarely as simple as popular culture suggests. Real investigations are messy. Real evidence can be incomplete. Real trials often involve uncertainty. The pursuit of truth is usually gradual, complicated, and imperfect. The murder of Walter Settlemere embodies all of those realities. Decades after the crime, the image remains haunting. A quiet Munich apartment, a beloved actor, a brutal attack, a crime scene that may have been staged, an investigation built piece by piece from tiny fragments of evidence, a courtroom forced to weigh certainty against doubt, and a legal legacy that extended far beyond the original murder. Some cases disappear into history. Others continue to provoke reflection long after the headlines fade. The murder of Walter Settlemere belongs firmly in the second category. It remains a story about violence, evidence, and accountability. But it is also a story about memory, about what societies choose to remember, what individuals hope to leave behind, and whether the passage of time can ever truly separate a person from the events that define them. More than 3 decades later, the questions raised by the case still resonate. And perhaps that is why the story endures. Not because every question has been answered, but because the case continues to challenge us to think about truth, justice, and the lasting consequences of a single night that changed many lives forever. Every criminal case leaves something behind. Sometimes it is a legal precedent. Sometimes it is a warning. Sometimes it is simply a collection of unanswered questions that survive long after the courtroom. Lights have been switched off, and the headlines have faded from public memory. The murder of Walter Settlemere left all 3. Years after the investigation ended and years after the convictions were handed down. The case continued to occupy a unique place in German criminal history. New crimes would dominate newspaper front pages. New scandals would capture public attention. New investigations would emerge. Yet the name Walter Settlemere never completely disappeared. Whenever discussions arose about circumstantial evidence, famous unsolved mysteries, controversial convictions, or the relationship between privacy and public memory, the case often resurfaced. Part of the reason lies in the unusual combination of factors that surrounded the crime. The victim was not an unknown individual whose death attracted attention only within his immediate community. Walter Settlemeyer was a recognizable figure throughout Bavaria. For many viewers, he represented familiarity, tradition, and continuity. His television roles had helped create an image that felt reassuring and predictable. The violence of his death shattered that image instantly. Another reason the case endured was the extraordinary brutality of the murder itself. Even decades later, the details remain difficult to read. A man was restrained. He suffered multiple stab wounds. He was repeatedly struck with a hammer. Investigators concluded that the level of violence exceeded what was necessary to cause death. Those facts ensured that the crime would never be remembered as an ordinary homicide. The attack appeared personal, intense, and relentless. Yet perhaps the most enduring aspect of the case was the uncertainty that existed around the evidence. The courts ultimately reached a clear conclusion. Wolfgang Worrell and Manfred Lauber were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. Under German law, responsibility for the murder was established. At the same time, the path to that conclusion was unusual. There was no eyewitness who could stand before the court and say, "I saw the attack happen." There was no confession that removed all doubt. There was no recording that captured the final moments of Walter Settlemeyer's life. Instead, investigators and prosecutors built their case from a collection of circumstances. Forensic findings, witness statements, and logical connections. The court accepted that chain of evidence as sufficient. The convictions remained in place. But because the case rested on indirect evidence rather than direct observation, debate never entirely disappeared. For some observers, the verdict demonstrated the strength of modern investigative methods. They argued that crime should not go unpunished simply because a killer avoids being seen. Circumstantial evidence, when properly assembled and carefully evaluated, can reveal the truth just as effectively as eyewitness testimony. Others remain more cautious. They pointed out that circumstantial cases inevitably leave room for questions. Not necessarily enough questions to overturn a conviction, but enough to sustain discussion. Human beings are naturally drawn to certainty. Cases like the Settlemeyer murder remind us that certainty is not always available. The legal system does not require absolute knowledge of every detail. It requires courts to evaluate evidence and reach conclusions according to established standards. That process occurred in Munich. The verdict was delivered. Appeals failed. The case was legally resolved. Yet history often operates differently than law. A courtroom can close a case. Public memory rarely does. The passage of time introduced another layer to the story. When Walter Settlemeyer was murdered in 1990, the internet as we know it today did not yet shape everyday life. Information traveled through newspapers, television broadcasts, magazines, and physical archives. Accessing old records often required effort. A person could move forward with life knowing that the past existed but was not constantly visible. The digital era changed that reality. Information became searchable. Archives became permanent. Historical events became accessible with a few keystrokes. As a result, the murder entered an entirely new chapter. Discussions that once centered on homicide investigation and criminal law expanded into debates about privacy and digital memory. The question was no longer only what happened in July 1990. The question became how society should remember what happened. Should serious criminal cases remain permanently available to the public? Should convicted individuals be allowed to distance themselves from crimes after serving their sentences? Does rehabilitation include the possibility of obscurity? Or does public interest outweigh that desire? The legal battles that followed demonstrated how a single murder can continue generating consequences decades after the original crime. What began as a homicide investigation evolved into a broader discussion about the nature of memory itself. In that sense, the story became larger than any individual participant. It became larger than the investigators, larger than the defendants, larger even than the victim. The case became part of an ongoing conversation about how societies preserve history. Yet amid those debates, it is important not to lose sight of the person at the center of the story. Before the legal arguments, before the newspaper coverage, before the courtroom proceedings, there was Walter Settlemeyer, an actor, a businessman, a public figure, a man whose life ended violently inside his own home. High-profile cases often risk reducing victims to symbols. They become known only through the circumstances of their deaths. But Walter Settlemeyer's story did not begin with a murder. It began decades earlier with a life, a career, and a reputation built over many years. That reality matters. The purpose of investigating homicide is not merely to identify offenders. It is also to acknowledge the value of the life that was lost. More than 3 decades after the crime, many details remain fixed in public memory. The apartment in Munich, the shocking discovery, the difficult investigation, the microscopic fibers that became crucial evidence, the famous trial, the convictions, the later legal disputes. Together, these elements form one of Germany's most discussed criminal cases. Yet perhaps the most striking feature of the story is how ordinary its beginning appears in retrospect. A trusted public figure living alone. People he knew entering his apartment. A night that seemed unremarkable at first. History is often shaped by moments that nobody recognizes while they are happening. Somewhere during the evening of July 14th, 1990, the final chapter of Walter Settlemeyer's life began. By the following morning, an entire country would be asking questions that investigators would spend years trying to answer. Many of those questions eventually received legal answers. Others became subjects of debate. A few may never be answered completely. And so the case remains suspended between certainty and uncertainty, between law and memory, between what can be proven and what can only be inferred. That tension is one reason the story continues to endure. The murder of Walter Settlemeyer is not remembered solely because it was brutal, nor solely because the victim was famous, nor solely because the trial relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. It is remembered because it sits at the intersection of all those things. A famous victim, a shocking crime, a painstaking investigation, a landmark trial, a continuing debate about privacy, accountability, and remembrance. In the end, the apartment on Elisabethstrasse became more than a crime scene. It became the starting point for a story that would travel through courtrooms, newspapers, legal textbooks, and public discussions for decades. And although the verdict was delivered long ago, the case continues to remind us of a simple truth. Some crimes end when a sentence is imposed. Others continue to echo through history long after everyone involved has left the courtroom.
जदू दा तू गया माही जान माड़ी टंगी है जदू दा तू गया माही जान माड़ी टंगी है दुख माड़े बंडन वाला कोई भी ना सकिए वो दुख माड़े बंडन वाला कोई भी ना सकिए सारी सारी रात तेरी यादां विच लंघी है सारी सारी रात तेरी यादां विच लंघी है यत दा तू गया